Ukraine claims ground fighting west of the capital with an assault by Russian paratroopers at Hostomel airport. Kiev says Russian forces have seized the area near Chernobyl. Less than 24 hours into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, fighting on three fronts with assaults by land, air, and sea. U.S. President Joe Biden to speak earlier. It was the British Prime Minister announcing an asset freeze for Russian banks. EU leaders are convening for an emergency summit in Brussels. In a rare move, French President Emmanuel Macron will address Parliament on Friday. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, a special edition here on France 24. Never since World War II has a sovereign state attacked another with such force. Russia making good on its offensive. This after a speech where President Vladimir Putin promised the de-nazification of Ukraine's democratically elected government. The Kremlin confirming that it has indeed sent ground forces over the border over in Moscow. Mixed reaction with more than 1,000 arrests of pro-peace activists this evening. Our coverage for this hour begins in Kiev. Let's cross to correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Gulliver, what's the latest where you are?
Well, first of all, I think we might underline that Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is not only democratically elected, he's also Jewish. So to describe this as a denazification operation against Ukraine is really pretty much ridiculous. I mean, if it weren't so horrific, it would be something that people might be able to just laugh about. Ukrainians are really absolutely horrified by what's happening. This is an attack that is completely unprovoked, and it does seem to be an attack across the whole country. It's hard to see what Vladimir Putin's war aims here could be other than regime change. And as you said, there has been fighting very, very near to the capital, Kiev, at the Hostomel airfield, which is only about 10 kilometers away from the city. Russian paratroopers came in, and although the Ukrainian side initially said that they had pushed back the attack, it now looks like they're confirming that the airfield has fallen under Russian control. And also, these two confirmations are from one advisor to President Zelensky, one member of his staff, Mihailo Podolyak, but he's also confirming that the Russian forces have taken control of the Chernobyl nuclear power station, what remains of it. Of course, it's under a protective cage, the reactor that exploded in 1986, but that's, of course, an extremely worrying development, combined with fighting in the east, around Kharkiv, around the city of Sumy, city in the south of Kherson, and shelling of airfields all over the country, including in the far west.
And right now, where you are in Kiev, it's quiet?
It's quiet right now. We've heard planes flying overhead, but I haven't been able to get confirmation as to whether those are Ukrainian military planes or Russian ones. But that's, of course, a bit unnerving. And from time to time, we can hear the thud of artillery somewhere very, very far away in the distance. Maybe it's that battle for the Hostomel airfield that we're able to hear from the center of Kiev. So it is relatively quiet right now. There's a curfew that's going to come into force at 10 p.m. until 7 a.m. I'm not sure that there would be that many people wanting to venture out after 10 p.m. anyway. People here are extremely worried and afraid, and a lot of people have been trying to leave the capital and head towards western Ukraine or even perhaps further into Poland and other EU countries.
Gulliver Cragg reporting live from the Ukrainian capital. We'll be crossing over to you later on. We are waiting for a EU summit to begin. Ahead of it, we heard speeches by the French president and the German chancellor. Let's go to Berlin and correspondent Nick Spicer. Nick, the Germans, how far are they going this evening? What reaction are you witnessing to what you just heard Gulliver Cragg describe?
I think the feeling here is one of shock and dismay. There's been a series of reactions coming out through the day. I mean, we'll start with Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, who said that this is Putin's war. It is the unscrupulous act of a man that destroys peace. His foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, said that Germany was stunned but not helpless, because she said that Ukrainians who wanted peace and democracy could not be pulled down, could not be put down. Their dream could not be killed. And she said it's a veiled warning, I think, to Vladimir Putin that that same dream of peace and democracy could not be killed in Russia either. Then Robert Habeck, who is the economy and environment minister, said that he felt like he was reading an old book of history about a European ground war, that this was a step back into the past and it should not be happening at all. And I think perhaps, you know, it's a moment of reckoning as well because of the way Germany behaved in the build-up to this war, to this attack on Ukraine, coming from a former defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who said, we have failed historically. We failed with Georgia, we failed with Crimea, and we failed now. We didn't stand up enough to Russia. It's all well and fine to have sanctions and to talk about diplomacy and to have talks with Russia, but there needs to be a military behind those discussions, a military threat of sorts.
A military threat of sorts, and Germany, which had been hesitant. We heard the chair of, I think it was the foreign, correct me if I'm wrong, the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag, saying that now is the time to supply Ukraine with weaponry.
You're absolutely right, Norbert Röttgen. I've spoken with him, not on this particular issue, but he's anything but a firebrand. He's a very considered individual, and he has said that, look, now I've changed my mind. Before I was against sending weapons to Ukraine, and a leading member of the Christian Social Union, which is the Bavarian wing of the same conservative bloc. It's a significant bloc. It's Angela Merkel's party that's been in power of 50 of the past 70 years, so what they say matters. You know, that perhaps it's time to do a rethink of this guilt-ridden policy where Germany has said, oh, we can't send weapons to Ukraine because of the horrible things that happened in World War II.
All right, we seem to have lost the connection there. Sorry about that. Nick Spicer, the sound with Berlin. We'll try to reconnect with you a little bit later on. If you're just joining us here on France 24, ground invasion on three sides. The latest we're getting is heavy shelling on the outskirts of the strategic port city of Mariupol. That's between the Russian border and annexed Crimea. That's according to a diplomatic source. We also are waiting for the U.S. president to speak, Joe Biden, to announce sanctions. Earlier, it was the turn of the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who announced a ban on Russia's national carrier Aeroflot going into the UK and the freezing of financial transactions coming in from Russia.
On top of these financial measures, and in full concert with the United States and the EU, we will introduce new trade restrictions and stringent export controls similar to those that they in the US are implementing. We will bring forward new legislation to ban the export of all dual-use items to Russia, including a range of high-end and critical technological equipment and components in sectors including electronics, telecommunications, and aerospace. The UK is announcing the largest and most severe package of economic sanctions that Russia has ever seen. With new financial measures, we're taking new powers to target Russian finance, in addition to the banks we've already sanctioned this week. Today, in concert with the United States, we are imposing a full asset freeze on VTB. More broadly, these powers will enable us totally to exclude Russian banks from the UK financial system, which is, of course, by far the largest in Europe, stopping them from accessing sterling and clearing payments through the UK.
And after London and before Washington, the focus right now is on Brussels. Let's cross to correspondent Dave Keating. Dave, what's the latest?
Well, the leaders are arriving now. They're just about to start their meeting, which was an emergency summit called yesterday, actually, originally in response to the recognition of the two breakaway regions. And of course, now, overnight, we've had the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So that's what they're going to be talking about. We know that by the end of tonight, there will be a second round of EU sanctions. The first one was only adopted yesterday. The question is, will it be all of the sanctions that could possibly be given, or will they want to save some some things just to have some kind of further stick to use. The two big things to watch are whether they freeze Russian companies' access to the SWIFT bank transfer system and whether they will target Vladimir Putin himself and ban him from travel, for instance. There are a lot of hesitant voices about that SWIFT action because it would be a very, very significant action and would very much hurt the Russian economy, but could have bounce back effects. And there are also some countries that are hesitant about banning Putin from travel and sanctioning him personally because it would cut off all lines of communication. And there is still some sliver of hope that a diplomatic solution can be figured out here. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in those next hours. The other thing that they may talk about is compensation for the countries that are going to be most impacted by these sanctions, and more significantly, the retaliatory action taken by Russia in response to the sanctions, which seems inevitable. We don't have any of those retaliatory actions yet, but of course everyone is very worried about Russia turning off the taps of gas. Germany and countries in the East would be the most affected by that. So there may be some discussion tonight about how to share the burden of the economic damage that these sanctions are inevitably going to cause.
Yeah, share the burden, and that was something we heard the leader of the opposition, Dave, in the House of Commons say, that there is going to be pain for citizens. How much pain on the continent?
A lot, I think. I think what we're hearing were energy prices. I mean, this is either going to be painful or a disaster. At the minimum, it's going to increase energy prices over the coming weeks. It could turn into a disaster if the taps are completely shut off and these key countries in Central Europe in particular run out of gas reserves. Now, I've been talking to analysts over the past 2 days about this. They seem to think that if the weather doesn't get unusually cold for March, which is always a possibility, Germany, for instance, probably has enough gas reserves to last out the winter and at least not plunge people into cold. But of course, that's only the energy issue. There is also the inflation issue. There's the damage to the markets that this has already caused. This will really, really affect people in their pocketbooks, and politicians want to try to prepare citizens for that. I think we're going to hear a lot of that tonight at the closing press conferences after this summit, that the prime ministers and presidents are going to say, look, the average person in the European Union is going to be hurt by these sanctions, by what's coming here, but it is worth it in defense of freedom. And of course, they will want to remind people that it is Vladimir Putin who started this war, not these Western leaders. They are merely reacting to it. But the actions they take could really, really have an effect on people's livelihoods throughout Europe and throughout the Western world.
Dave Keating, many thanks, and we'll be crossing live to you as that summit in Brussels gets underway of European leaders. Let's go to Moscow. Alexander Lukin is with the National Research University Higher School of Economics, the author of China and Russia, the New Rapprochement. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
You just heard our Brussels correspondent saying that citizens in the West have to brace themselves for pain going forward. It's only just sinking in here. What about over where you are? Are citizens ready for the pain of sanctions and boomerang effects?
Well, I think there will be some hardships. That's true, but I don't think that many people understand clearly already what's going on and what might happen, because it's only one day and they don't have this enough information. But Russians are kind of used to hardships, so I don't think it will be a terrible problem here. We are living under sanctions already since 2014. Of course, this time it will be a bit worse, but I think we'll survive somehow.
Are Russians surprised by the scale of this invasion?
Most of the people do, I would say, especially experts. I myself yesterday was telling everyone that a big military operation is probably impossible because it's not in the interests of any side. But at the same time, of course, it's understandable now. And the President Putin took a pretty radical decision. We don't know yet what's going to happen. but most people understand it and support it. Also, there are some people who are against, of course. There were even some kind of anti-war actions this evening.
Yeah, with some 1,000 arrests. I have to ask you, because it was business as usual. Meanwhile, at the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin welcoming Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan in Moscow for a 2-day visit. There was a photo op. Upon landing in the Russian capital, Khan is heard on video quipping, "What a time I have come. So much excitement." And while Pakistan tries to maintain friendly relations with all sides, I want to draw your attention to what reporters pressed the Chinese Foreign Ministry on. They asked why Beijing refuses to use the word invasion. Let's listen.
This is a typical way for European and American media to ask questions, using the word invasion based on preconceptions. What I can tell you is that China is closely watching the latest situation, and we also call on all parties to maintain restraint and prevent the situation from getting out of control.
So 2 questions, Alexander Lukin. How much does China have Russia's back, and how much is Russia beholden now to China?
Well, when you present all this Western narrative, you should understand that your part of the world is not the largest part of the world. It's a small part of the world. And so China is one country which has its own opinion. When you talk about India or any other big country, non-Western, they also do not support this Western narrative. China is one of them, and China has its own opinion. China basically supports territorial integrity of all countries, and here it does not support Russia, but at the same time, it thinks that NATO expansion and the United States policy in general is hostile to China. The United States openly calls in its official document China an enemy.
But my question was, is Russia going to become more dependent on China?
Why should it become more dependent? There is a lot of cooperation going on. The trade is growing. China, in what way it's dependent? Russia is selling a lot of raw materials to China, that's true, but China is also interested in that. And if you sell something to somebody, it doesn't mean that you're dependent on it. So I don't even understand the question.
All right. Well, the question was about Russia. If it's in the future not going to be selling commodities to the West, we'll be having to sell them more towards the East. Alexander Lukin of the National Research University Higher School of Economics, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
At this point in time, we want to just remind you, if you're just joining us here on France 24, that there is fighting reported some 10 kilometers outside of Ukraine's capital, an airfield that's to the west of capital Hostomel airfield. There's also been the Ukrainian Prime Minister's office confirming that Russian forces in their ground invasion of Ukraine have taken the area near Chernobyl. That's near the Belarus border. Right now, I want to also just welcome back on set Anastasia Shepochkina from the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, France 24 International Affairs Editor Douglas Herbert, and we also have with us Mark Perlman. Mark, we heard from the British Prime Minister at the outset here. At midday, we heard from the French President. Let's listen to Emmanuel Macron.
En refusant la voie diplomatique, en choisissant la guerre, le président Poutine n'a pas seulement attaqué l'Ukraine. Il a décidé de bafouer la souveraineté de l'Ukraine. Il a décidé de porter l'atteinte la plus grave à la paix, à la stabilité dans notre Europe depuis des décennies.
What's Emmanuel Macron planning? We know he's going to speak before Parliament on Friday. We know also that there's a NATO meeting convened. What is going on the military front, first of all?
Well, first of all, just a quick remark. You saw those very unusual three flags. I mean, normally when the French president speaks, there's the French flag, the European flag. There was a third flag, the Ukrainian flag behind him. That's obviously a symbol to show solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and that's very unusual for the French president. Then, obviously, France is conveying its solidarity to the Ukrainian people. But the question is, what else? Sanctions, we know there'll be further sanctions, European sanctions. France said it would help Ukraine. How will it help? Financially? Yes. Militarily? There's the question mark there, because obviously this is much more dangerous territory, because we know obviously that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so there are no NATO troops on the ground. We know some countries have been helping Ukraine militarily. Others have not been as enthusiastic, especially Germany. France has not been very vocal. We don't really know what's happening. And as usual with the French government, there's no information, because the president decides everything when it comes to military matter. We know there was a special meeting of his defense council, as it's known this morning. What was decided, we don't really know.
Because there is a worst case scenario, of course, which for the French, which is you have Ukrainian forces chased by Russian troops across the border into Poland. And then, if somehow Poland or one of the other neighboring states, Poland, which is an EU member, which is a NATO member, then what does France do?
Well, it becomes a NATO issue then, because, I mean, the fact that Poland is an EU country militarily doesn't mean anything, as the French president has regretted in public. But because it's a member of NATO, Article 5 of NATO means an attack against any member of NATO becomes an attack against the alliance, and the alliance has to respond. So that's obviously what everyone thinks Vladimir Putin will not do, because that's a whole different ballgame, because this means attacking NATO, Europe, Canada, and obviously the US.
Anastasia Shapochkina, Emmanuel Macron, he's gotten a bit of a rough ride the last few weeks, in Washington in particular, for trying his mediation with Vladimir Putin. Your reaction to what Mark Perlman has spelled out and what you're expecting from that Friday speech before the French Parliament, which is an unusual move for a French president to speak.
He will not deliver it himself. It will be delivered on his behalf.
It will be delivered on his behalf, okay.
I do agree that, of course, the presentation, so to say, what the French is always very good at, right? The presentation has been very well set up. So there is a third flag. Congratulations. So far, it stops there. France, Ukraine, and any post-Soviet country has never been among the key interests of the French foreign policy. France has found itself within the Normandy format and dragged into there by François Hollande, who acted on the legacy of Nicolas Sarkozy's actions, diplomatic actions in Georgia. And however, it doesn't change the fact that, of course, strategic interest and historic interest and political interest of France is much more aligned with Russia than with any other country of the post-Soviet space. And that, of course, puts certain brakes on the actions of the politicians. There are big French companies, including Total, for example, energy company, which are very present. It's not the only one, which are very present in Russia. Société Générale, just was noted by the economic analyst, lost a lot of its market value because it's the most exposed, for example, but it's exposed because of its presence in Russia as well. And it's one of the many, many French companies in Russia which are present. Now, some of them are also have important government shareholding, like Total, for example, and none of the projects, including big oil and gas exploration projects in which Total is involved in Russia, are decided without the French government. This is going to be, of course, putting some limits, I'd say, upon the French action. And second, any military action would be, of course, seen as a surprise, not just by Russia, but also by Turkey in the region, because France is not considered to be a military actor there. And if it takes a serious position, it means a change to its foreign policy, which it would have to then support with military, maybe with man, and over the long term.
Just very briefly, Mark Perlman, I have to ask you a domestic politics question, because we have an election coming up at the beginning of April, and the incumbent is due to announce his candidacy. Is Ukraine going to be is it a factor yet right now?
It is already a factor. He was supposed to throw his hat into the ring this week. He had to postpone it. He said, I have two issues I have to deal with. COVID seems to improve. Geopolitical situation is not improving. And so he was very involved, too involved, some would say, in shuttle diplomacy to try to avoid what's happening in the last 24 hours. But there is a deadline, which is March 4th, where this is the deadline where candidates have to declare their candidacy before the Constitutional Council. So it's 10 days away. So it already has had an impact. Obviously, he can clearly say that he's been involved in foreign policy, but eventually he'll have to forget that and speak about housing, health, education, immigration, etc.
And Mark Perlman, our politics editor, as you've been pointing out, there is that bread and butter issue of inflation. And on a day when we've seen a barrel of oil go above $100 on the markets here in Europe and edging closer to $100 a barrel over in New York. Let's get a reaction from Salman Al-Ansari, founder and president of the Washington, D.C. based Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Merci beaucoup, François.
Salman, the crisis that we're seeing unfold, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, first off, how's it being perceived where you are?
Yeah, thank you so much, and hi to all the viewers and to your honorable guests. I think it's definitely very concerning, with no doubt. The kingdom has always been asking for diplomacy, for resolving issues, for de-escalations, for any conflict. But since the topic is tricky and very sensitive, I need to have a disclaimer, which is very well known already, that I do not speak on behalf of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but rather as an independent Saudi researcher. And I assure you that the kingdom is seriously concerned about this. People might think that oil producers around the world are kind of content with the rise of oil prices, but this is actually not accurate. Yes, it is important for all the oil producers to have fair kind of like prices for their commodities. But at the same time, this issue, to me, it kind of reminds me of the swamp that Saddam has put himself into when he invaded Kuwait. So I think, and I actually believe that President Putin has made a very bloody mistake by invading Ukraine. But at the same time, to be absolutely honest, because there is actually an Arab proverb that by Umar ibn al-Khattab that says, stick to honesty even if it kills you. But in my humble opinion, and to be fully honest, both Russia and the West share some kind of a responsibility of the current escalation that is primarily caused by not taking Minsk agreements seriously and for the constant provocations from both sides. And also
constant provocations from both sides. What we're now looking ahead to is we're waiting for remarks from the U.S. President Joe Biden. One of the measures he might announce is the release of a strategic reserve of oil and gas. The United States is a producer of crude. But will he then be, in your view, on the telephone to the king or the crown prince to talk a little bit about whether or not they too can help out by pumping out more oil?
Yeah, I think we have to put things into context. Last year, President Biden blamed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the fossil fuel at the climate summit. And subsequently, Francois, 1 week later, he asked Riyadh to increase its oil production to lower the prices of oil. And it was a way to throw the blame on Saudi so he can cover up his primary responsibility for all his missteps after he knocked down the U.S. shale oil industry. So
are you saying that the Crown Prince won't pick up the phone?
It's not about picking up the phone. The U.S. will always remain as the most strategic ally, not only partner, to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, the current administration has made a lot of mistakes against the custodian of the two holy mosques, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the center of Islam, by calling it a pariah. So you call Saudi Arabia a pariah the moment you don't think you need it, and the moment you need Saudi Arabia, you call it a partner. Saudi Arabia doesn't like to play these games. So I think the United States, the ball is in the court of the United States to rectify the trajectory of its conception.
And if you see a gold-plated invitation to go to the White House to the Crown Prince, if he says, let bygones be bygones, let's forget about the Jamal Khashoggi affair, let's forget about Yemen for a little while, let's come on over to the White House, all is forgiven, or you are welcome. At that point in time, what will Saudi Arabia's view be towards Russia?
I think it's not like that at all. People are thinking Saudi Arabia is somehow taking sides here and there. No, Saudi Arabia has the absolute sovereignty to multiply its relationships and to strengthen its relationships with all the world powers and all nations. And let's not forget the fact that Saudi Arabia has been the trusted ally for the United States since the beginning and the inception of Saudi Arabia, by having the golden rule, which is oil for security, and by putting down the Soviet Union, and also by countering terrorism. So Saudi Arabia is the golden key for the United States in the region, that's for sure. But putting the blame...
Just to remind our viewers on that point, in the 1980s, the Saudis helped keep the price of oil low. And
exactly.
You could say that that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed. They were over-reliant on oil and gas at the time.
Yeah.
Could a scenario like that happen again?
Let's not forget also last year, or 2 years ago, at the beginning of the corona crisis, Riyadh used a shock tactic against Russia by increasing its production to the maximum to get Russia in line with OPEC plus previous agreements. Despite being upset by the move, which is Moscow was under pressure, but eventually followed suit. So Saudi Arabia doesn't want to use oil as a military kind of tactic, but to make sure that all OPEC members are following suit and working on stabilizing the energy market, Saudi Arabia can take real actions because it's the central bank of energy in the whole world.
Salman Al-Ansari, one final question for you. Of late, relations have been fairly good between Saudi Arabia and Russia. In fact, they call it OPEC plus, I think is the term that's used. Russia's been involved in talks with it's had a seat at the table at OPEC. At this point in time, which way would Saudi Arabia go? Does invading Ukraine signal a divorce or not?
I think we should ask the question to the primary affected nations, such as the EU, for example. Will there be a divorce between Germany and Russia? Not at all. Even like the Minister of International Affairs of Germany himself said Nord Stream 2 might be excluded from the sanctions bundle. So I think the idea of divorce and marriage of convenience, and sometimes to be their friends and sometimes to go and turn against them, is not good in terms of strategic relationships. Yes, indeed. And Saudi Arabia has been traditionally having this firm position of being consistent and being a voice of reason, which is conducive towards calm, avoiding escalation, and resolving disputes through diplomacy and protecting citizens. But Saudi Arabia does not like to have fiery speeches on public, but rather to have discussions and dialogues with their partners in closed rooms. That's the traditional Saudi stance.
Salman Al-Ansari of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee, thank you so much for speaking with us from Riyadh.
Thank you so much.
Anna Shapachkina, your thoughts, because we're getting a lot of frenzied activity at the White House. We're getting ready to watch. We can perhaps show that they're setting up for Joe Biden to speak in a few minutes' time. We're getting bits and bobs. about specific entities and people being sanctioned. Canada's just announced sanctions against 58 entities and individuals. When it comes to sanctions, can you do surgical strikes?
I think that's really way too late for surgical strikes. They have proven entirely ineffective since 2014. Sanctions that the US has announced so far until today just make you laugh because they include things like export banning from LNR and DNR into the US, which I wonder what are those experts, and then sanctions against Vladimir Putin personally. I think he can restrain himself from traveling to Nice in the next few years after having invaded a country. And I'm just wondering how effective that can actually be. And that just shows that, indeed, again, Russian bet that the European Union is going to be divided is working, that the people are...
It's working? You think it's working?
I think it's working because of what we've heard of our Brussels correspondent telling us about German concerns about the possible... monetary compensations of their suffering from sanctions.
Along with Italy and along with Cyprus, there are other countries as well that are weak links in that chain.
Of
Absolutely.
course. And then Germany is still hesitating about supplying weapons, France not being able to pronounce how it's going to stand on military assistance. The only assistance that Ukraine is now asking for is military assistance, meaning troops and weapons. That is the type of assistance that the Western leaders were able to provide to Germany during the Cold War, and that's the type of assistance that restrained the Soviet advance into Germany. And that is the type of assistance we're not seeing here.
And also there's a sort of a timing mechanism at work here, or at play, because in the time that we've been sitting here debating the sanctions debate, and the Europeans talking about sanctions and the Americans talking about sanctions, gradual stage sanctions, of first limited sanctions, now that there's a full invasion, a broader package of, more severe, massive sanctions. We've had facts being established on the ground right now in Ukraine, across Ukraine, over the past hour of this discussion here. So in other words, before you could sort of blink...
Just remind our viewers about those facts on the ground changing.
Invasion by... I use the word invasion objectively. I'm not using that as an editorial statement. The invasion by various land, sea, and air by Russia over the past 18 to 20 hours right now has basically come from all points north, east, and south. I don't say west because that's the border with the eastern flank of NATO countries. But we've seen it coming down really towards the second biggest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv. We've seen it down in the southeast by Mariupol, but we've also seen it by the key strategic port of port city Odessa. We're seeing it in the center of Ukraine, where we see sort of the beginnings of movements around Kiev. It could end up, and this is. A day ago, this would have been far-fetched for me to sit here and say this, but Kiev surrounded.
We could maybe call up a map on that.
Let's do it.
It's important to mention this. You mentioned places like Odessa.
Well, I'm mentioning places right now, Francois, that 24 hours ago, we were all laser-focused on Donetsk and the rebel-held territories. And I remember sitting here saying the important thing you see. Look at the east, the very east of Ukraine, right? The rebel head, that is the separatist-controlled areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. I was talking the other day about, but there's the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, which are in yellow on this map here. They're controlled by the Ukrainian government, but they are claimed by the rebels. The territory that the separatists claimed was 3 times larger, as of yesterday at least, than what they actually held. Look at this. We're sitting on the set 24 hours later, and that statement is now, it's no longer factually correct. We don't know what the situation right now, as we have been speaking and having this discussion here tonight, of the actual control, whether it's in the pro-Russian separatists. Actually, I'll just say Russian hands, because pro-Russian separatist is a ridiculously clunky term. It's essentially Russian hands. And now we're talking about the rest of the Ukraine. Look at that map there. Kiev, okay, right? The oblasts right now, the districts around Zhytomyr, Kiev district around there, we already have movements in those areas. Odessa, I just talked about, the key port city. We have Mariupol, which will be a key link between Crimea and the rebel-held territories. It was a key flashpoint in 2014. I remember being there. It was an extremely tense situation. We're right back where we started, but in a much more perilous and dangerous phase right now.
A much more perilous and dangerous phase. The French government recommending its citizens in Ukraine stay indoors, given the risks of traveling in the country. We can maybe hear in the last 20 hours, as Doug was saying, how much things have changed. First, it was that speech by Vladimir Putin, and then there was a speech by the Ukrainian president himself, Volodymyr Zelensky, who spoke half the time in Ukrainian, half the time in Russian. He's a native Russian speaker. His speech in Russian was a plea to citizens across the border.
Кто может этого не допустить?
Who can stop the war? People. These people are among you, I am sure.
Уверен, что нужно остановиться.
We should stop before it's too late.
Если руководство
If the Russian leadership doesn't want to sit down at the negotiating table,
за стол с нами, возможно,
they should sit at the table with you.
с вами. Хотят ли русские войны?
Do Russians want war?
Я очень хотел
I'd love to answer this question, but the answer depends only on you.
только от вас.
How's Ukraine's government faring under the circumstances of all that's happened since he made that speech?
The Ukrainian government is in place. They are in their offices. They are there in Kyiv. At least my contacts who I talked to this morning and then this afternoon. They are obviously issuing a lot of communication throughout the day via official websites, but they have been also subject to cyber attacks in the last time, but also all the time, in fact. And so some Ukrainian government representatives have switched to Facebook, to their own Facebook accounts, to update on the official government information about the places taken, the airports bombed, the state of the railroad, for example, and then of course counting a lot on the Ukrainian, it's called like public broadcasting Hromadske, to also communicate a lot of this information from the government. And they are trying to calm the situation down, to call people not to panic, to emphasize that their information is the military targets that are going to be targeted, that if you're sitting in a village or in town, like, sit there, because that's unlikely that's going to be targeted unless there is a military base.
Yeah, we saw exceptions like with that housing project near Kharkiv.
Of course.
What was your reaction when you heard Volodymyr Zelensky issue that plea directly to the Russian people?
I wouldn't say just the first thing is that of course there's not exceptions. It's just the Russians are shelling a lot of also villages, and especially Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. People have been evacuated from there into the rest of Ukraine, and now we see the advancement of troops. Of course, there is a lot of shelling going on everywhere, and we are going to see later basically what's going to happen with the civilian population. Although, how for the Zelensky's turn to the Russian people. First, my first reaction is there are two reactions. First is I'm not sure the Russian people are going to watch President Zelensky and his speech, number one. And number two, those Russian people who are agreeing full-heartedly with President Zelensky, they already have...
I'm going to interrupt you because U.S. President Joe Biden is set to speak. We're going to cross over to the White House.
Good afternoon. The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. Without provocation, without justification, without necessity, this is a premeditated attack